Ah, hello. You find me on my mastermind chair. I should have had a cat, shouldn't I, to stroke. I thought we'd just quickly show you the new room. Not that it's very exciting at the minute, it still needs decorating, but you saw in a previous episode, I think it was 2 ago, Rich was starting to construct this room. We've had this reception area for ages, and it's just been really bad use of the space, so we decided to construct an extra room within the area so we could have meetings, etc. So anyway, we don't need to see a load of sterling board and the like. I'll perhaps show you that again when it's all done. So, Project Utah, that's probably the first one to cover. In fact, this is one of the seats. I think Nat mentioned last time that Dean was just starting to do the upholstery on the seats. And he mentioned that we'd refoam the back seat. He didn't mention, I don't think, that the front seats are actually not Mark II Jag seats at all. They're a seat that we've used before. We used them in Kaiser 1, and they're XJ40 Daimler seats. And we quite like these seats because they've got, everything's electric on them, but they're quite a nice slim design. A lot of modern seats look really fat and kind of just unsuited to old cars, but they're quite a nice slim design, but with all the modern functionality. And the Daimler ones particularly have these really cool little tray tables that fold out from the back on a really nice chrome hinge mechanism. And they've also got this very nice kind of single panel surround on this front section, single panel of leather with no seams, which just looks really cool as well. So that's what seats we were using in Utah. We're just doing the armrest on this one. Dean's finished the upholstery on the passenger seat, but the driver's seat's having a fold-out armrest, which is the same as one we did on Kaiser 1, which is the usual over-engineering, but essentially that's a mount plate that we put into the side of the seat. There's then a massive shoulder bolt and then a fabricated metal armrest that runs on phosphor bronze bushes on that. And it has like a milled out slot in the pivot, so which limits its travel, which just means it's really strong. But I always think they should be, because it's very possible to completely lift yourself up with your arm on a seat like that. And unless that's ridiculously strong, it's just going to flex. Yeah, like Jamie's chair. Jamie somehow always collapses his chairs. But yeah, so we're just in the middle of engineering that armrest, so that's going well. I'll show you the progress on the centre console. So last time James was just in the early stages of roughing out this centre console design. I've since had another discussion with the customer, and we revised some of the details. We got rid of the cup holder because decided he would probably not likely to use that, and simplified a few things. And this is more or less the final incarnation of that now. So the main panel you see there, what looks like wood on there, is going to be an aluminium panel that we're going to CNC cut, and then it's the recesses into all these apertures are actually chamfered. We were taking quite a lot of inspiration from sort of 1950s Rolls-Royce stuff, and they often had these sections of the wood dash that had a nice chamfer back to a black panel behind, and that's where we've got that idea from. And then the panels behind on here will be black anodised aluminium sheet that mount the switches in the top, and we're using what they call chicken head switches, amusingly. They're often found on guitars and amps, and we're using those for a number of functions, so things like the headlight switch, the wiper switch. And then we're also doing, on this section here, we're doing a rotary switch for the start, which is something we came up with quite early in the design process. Just thought it was a nice feature, and there's not many cars I can think of where you have a rotary momentary switch for start. So you crank it over to the side and then let go, and that starts your engine. You'll have the vintage air heater control and aircon control panel in there. And then the base part, I'll just give this a little rotate. In this section is a place where you put your phone. There's going to be a wireless charger in that hole in the middle there, and that's something we've actually done in both the Kaiser Mercedes. This one, the base of this piece is going to be trimmed in leather, and likewise this little recess here, which is just a general coin tray. Again, that's going to be covered in leather in the bottom of there, mainly for reasons of scratching coins, etc. in there, or your phone moving around in here. We don't want it to scratch what will be a black anodised aluminium finish on everything else. These slots here are for the audio and navigation controls. A bit of a bugbear I have about a lot of sort of modern head units and quite a lot of modern cars is the lack of really easy to reach and controls that fall to hand for the basic functions. I mean, touchscreen alone is almost completely useless in my opinion, because trying to do the volume or track skipping, etc. on a touchscreen while you're driving along is almost impossible. You want something you can actually feel to hand. So on these Alpine Freestyle units we use, they're touchscreen, but then they've got separate switch panels that sit down here. What's up, Joe? So that they have separate switch panels that sit down here, which just fall really nicely to hand. So that's what goes in there. Obviously gear stick through here, and there's a machined, what will be polished aluminium bezel there. If we just flip this over, you can see more detail on the construction. So the black piece here is a single piece of aluminium that will be machined from billet and black anodised. And then these sections which form the housing for the cordless charger, and the housing that holds the audio controls and forms the base of the coin tray. Those two are going to be 3D printed parts. And then the holes up through here lead to blind threaded holes in the billet aluminium part. So that will bolt up together onto a sheet base. And then that same base will have bracketry that the top fascia panel attaches down to. So that's all of that lot. Now I talked about taking a bit of design inspiration from sort of 1950s Rolls-Royce. On that note, I don't think I've ever shown anybody these before. We might have mentioned them in the Utah series, but these are the instruments that we had custom made for this project, which very heavily took a bit of inspiration from Rolls-Royce again. So we've got this really cool upside down speedo here, and then we've got the tacho built into the top of it. And just some of the details we did, so the little red ends on the needles, RPM, and then the lettering hundreds written underneath. This was all kind of a bit of Rolls-Royce inspiration. And then the other instrument, which is a combination water temp, oil pressure, fuel and voltage with a clock in the middle of it. I'm hoping that when they're set into the wooden dash, or as we've probably explained before, the dash is actually aluminium, but it's going to be hydro dipped with a wood finish, and that goes for this centre console as well. So it's a formed aluminium piece that we're having the chamfers machined in, then it'll be rolled to the curve, then it'll be hydro dipped with the wood grain finish. And that's actually why some people were asking about the wood trims in the car, and it seemed odd that we were epoxy priming them. And the reason for that is that we are hydro dipping a fake wood grain onto those trims, which might seem slightly strange, but it's something we've done before. The finish you can get with that hydro dipping process is absolutely amazing, virtually indistinguishable from real wood, and it allows us a lot more creativity. So we can make parts that would be much harder to make in wood than they would be to make in aluminium, and then hydro dip them with that finish. But of course, to get continuity of finish throughout, any of the original parts we're using that were wood, we need to hydro dip with the wood finish. So that's why we were prepping them, sealing them all in with epoxy primer, so we could then hydro dip them with a wood grain. So that's that. And the instruments. Another thing, talking about wood grain, the door top cappings. There's a wood section down the door which is going to be hydro dipped with the wood grain finish. Now this is the original, or one of the original top sections off the door, and one of the bits we weren't mad keen on is that it has these stainless steel, or chrome I think they were originally, screws that are visible on the top, and we didn't really like that. And one of the things we've been trying to do on the design of the interior is tone down the wood a little bit, the amount of wood, because originally the dash top was wood, the dash fascia was wood. It seemed a bit like wood overload. So we've changed the design so that the dash wood kind of flows into the wood on the doors, but the top of the dash is black leather. And likewise, we wanted to make the top of the doors black leather, but also get around this issue with the visible screws, and try and improve the stability of the material a little bit, because quite a lot of these were warped. So we are milling new ones of these out of aluminium. We've got some aluminium bar that's almost the right shape, so it'll just be putting the radius onto it. We've then come up with the idea of, we're going to drill and tap it, put press studs bolted in from the underside and press studs on the door. So these will actually click in with press studs, so there's no visible fasteners. And they're going to be black leathered, so we're going to machine them down by the relevant amount. The thickness of the leather, once it's on there, means they're still the same thickness as the originals. So that's one of the things we're doing on there. We talked about the heating and aircon system last time. We were 3D printing some new vents for that, which has been done. There was a question, I think, about the material for that. So for final interior parts where they might be subjected to quite a lot of heat, particularly on a heater box, we print them in carbon reinforced PETG, which is a lot more heat resistant than PLA. And it's a hell of a lot stronger. It has little fine carbon strands into the mixture of it, and it is incredibly strong actually. You wouldn't believe how strong the parts we make in that are. So the heater box is now in for the final time. Those vents are done. We're getting the ducting in for that. One of the other things we've just had in process is the column shroud. We're having the shroud 3D scanned and printed, which will be printed in carbon reinforced PETG, so we can extend the top shroud to meet our revised dashboard shape. I'm going to do both sides of it anyway, just because the original's Bakelite and they have a tendency to crack. There's certain parts of it which always seem to crack. There's a little thin bit that sticks out next to the slot for the indicator stalk, which always seems to be missing on these, and it is on both the ones we've got. So I'm going to make both those column pieces in 3D print, just as it's a bit more stable than the original material. And then also the little window that originally said overdrive at the top, we're retrofitting the warning lights in there, so things like the indicator telltales, the main beam warning light, the charge warning light, that's all going to be in there. Trev's been on with the brake plumbing. He was just starting that last week. That's now all done. I think some people were asking about why we're doing it in hardline when a lot of the cars we've done before, we use braided throughout, and that's certainly true. A lot of the cars we've done, the entire brake system is done in Teflon lined stainless braided hose. On this one, it was more that we're trying to keep the engine bay looking quite classic, and we've gone to a lot of lengths on the engine to make the engine look really period and classic. And we just thought, you know what, it would look much cooler and much more classic to have copper hardlines in there. So they're copper nickel hardlines we've done. We have done stainless steel fittings, so all the end fittings are in stainless steel to avoid that horrible corrosion you get on the zinc ones. But that's the reason we did that. Aircon plumbing is going to be going in next. That's probably the next step on the plumbing side of things. I've literally just been doing the headlining, so I've just taken time out from that to do this video, but later today I'm going to finish getting that headlining in there. And that then kind of starts a trickle of interior progress, so we can get the glass in once the headlining's in. We can start getting the pillar trims in. As soon as that dash fascia is done, we can get all of the parts off for Hydro Dip, and that really is the big point at which we can really start seeing progress there. So yeah, I'm really excited to see that progress. The Escort, the electric power steering conversion is done. I think that I'd done all the fabrication on that last time, but all the parts have been painted now, completely assembled and fitted in the car. Not much point going into any more on that at the minute. The next job on that is the bushes. If we rewind to when we were doing the initial shakedown on this car, we had normal off-the-shelf Escort World Cup crossmember bushes, which are basically a rubber bush inside a steel tube with an inner steel tube, and they push into tubes in the crossmember. And that design was very favourable in rally cars because it's a fail-safe design, because the bolt goes through the middle of a tube. Even if the rubber bush disintegrates, it can't come off completely. The downside is because they're largely designed for the rally market, the rubber in those bushes is extremely stiff, and to be honest, they're very cheaply made. And the variation in the shore rating of the rubber in them seems to be quite vast. We realised very early on that they were going to be too stiff, so we made a tool to cast our own polyurethane bushes for that. And we did 2 variations of that, going progressively softer until we were reasonably happy with it. But both ourselves and Gordon still think the engine vibration is just a touch higher than you'd really want. It's not horrible, it's not massively intrusive, but when you fire the car up, it just feels a little bit less refined than you'd like. And we're worried that if we go any softer on the poly bushes, they're going to get to the point where they might actually tear and fall apart. So at the moment, we're having some tooling made to do our own run of the bonded rubber bushes, but in a much softer shore rating of rubber, which should hopefully then give us the refinement that we want on that. So watch this space on that one. Stratos, drive shafts are now in. Super exciting moment earlier this week when the first time we actually not only started it up, but put it in gear, came off the clutch, and just tried it through all the gears, even with it on the stands. But it was cool just to see the hubs turning, and we're only one step away really from being able to drive it around the yard. That step at the moment being that we had a little electrical issue on the ECU. You'll notice probably you've never seen any shots of it revving, and that's because it's got a fly-by-wire throttle, and we had a problem with the electrical system that powers a number of the engine sensors. They have a 5-volt feed, reference feed from the ECU. Essentially the sensors vary the resistance to a feed back to the ECU, so the ECU knows that the change in voltage from 5 to 0 tells it how wide open or hot, cold, whatever those sensors are. One of the 5-volt circuits wasn't producing 5 volts, and we've traced that to an ECU fault actually, so that's now rectified. which means that Chris from Northampton Motorsport can come over. He can now finish the calibration work he was doing, get that fly-by-wire throttle pedal working, and that means hopefully we can actually blip the throttle, which is the thing I know all of us want to see. And once we get to that stage, we'd be in a stage to trickle it around the yard. It will more or less be mechanically complete then. So that's I keep saying everything's exciting, but that is very exciting. I'll just pause here briefly because I made a list. Just make sure I've taken everything in. I think I have. Yeah, that will do on that, I think. We'll make our way through this way. I'm going to take this moment to mention that the t-shirts and hoodies we have, I've just done a restock of those, and so there are plenty of stock available in our shop at the moment. If you go to the website, retropower.co.uk, that is where you can find those. So we'll mosey along here. Last time Stu was working on the front end metalwork, which the sort of bulk of the roughing out work is all done on that. So he's moved on to the rear, which is taking shape pretty nicely. I think this week he's done the bulk of the metalwork on this rear wing. A few little tweaks still to do. I'm not totally happy with the shape here. It's not quite the same as the one that we modelled on the other side. But the gist is just really exciting to start seeing that overall wing shape coming together in the steel. So we're going to do some tweaks on that. Stu's off today, but when he's back he's going to do some tweaks on that. We'll get the other side done. And then I think the moment we've all been looking forward to on this is that at that stage we can actually get it off the jig and drop it onto its wheels, which is the first time we're really going to get to see that car in all its glory at normal height that you'll actually see it from, because it's all very well sort of seeing all the body shape change, but when it's sat up miles in the air like this you don't quite see it from the angle you're going to see it from eventually. Move this way, I'll try not to trip over stuff. The CV8 chassis, we picked it up last week. This week we've been getting it on to our jig, getting it all dimensionally set correctly on the jig and basically checking all of the dimensional data on it to make sure everything's in the right place. And then Nat's been looking forward to getting the Jag back end offered into there. So he's finished the build up of the dry build back end. One thing he's been working on this week is quite a cool little track system, which involves basically a fabricated track and a motorcycle lift, which allows us to get the rear axle in there with it not under the car, slide it under the car and raise it up on the lift. And that was created out of repeatedly needing something a little bit more precise to try and get something into place, because although we'll set everything accurately to the jig, it's incredibly difficult with something heavy like that to do it, because you end up with two guys lifting, putting blocks under, etc., until you've got it all in the right place. So that's quite a good solution to being able to get that axle in there into place and everything being under a bit more control than it sometimes is. So getting that axle into place is going to be the next thing. It looks like there's going to be a few changes to the bulkhead, which we expected, but not excessive, which is what we had our fingers crossed for. We didn't want to intrude too far into the back seat space, and it looks like we won't have to. So the next step is to do that, and then of course to get the engine and gearbox slung in, which is the thing I'm sure everybody's been waiting to see. Scott is working on the Chevette as usual. He's been working on the radiator area on this. So one of the things that's quite notable on the Chevette is that the front height is very short, and the bonnet has a section that dips down in the middle on the frame, which means that in the standard position the radiator can only be quite short or a long way back. And from a working on the engine space point of view, and especially considering we've got a dry sump belt train to go in there, we've got the dry sump tank over there, you really want the radiator as far forward as possible to give you space. But of course we want to get as big a radiator as we can in there. A tried and tested size for this kind of engine is just a Group 4 Escort spec radiator, which is what we're doing on this. So we made the decision to refabricate a lot of the front area of the car there, so we could get a Group 4 Escort radiator in right forward to give us loads of space around the engine and really maximise the airflow into it. So Scott's been refabricating that whole front panel area so that there's nothing at all blocking the core of the radiator. He's incorporated the side mounts for the radiator into a panel that blocks off all of the airflow to anything other than the radiator. So any air entering that front intake on the car is forced through the radiator, with the exception of a 100mm diameter hole that we'll put this side, which will feed the cold air to the engine intake. And he's doing a really neat job of how it integrates into the slam panel here. On these side sections, there used to be a change of angle here that sort of brought this straight back across here, and we realised that if we carried on this initial angle right to the corner of where the radiator sits, that was a straight line. So we've reshaped this slam panel each side, reformed that downward flange, and then at the moment is literally in the process of doing the sheet metal surround for the radiator. And once that's all welded into place, it should really look like that's how it would always have been. And that's always the aim, I suppose, with a lot of our builds, just to try and do them in a fashion that if you didn't know what the car originally looked like, it looks like it's not been modified. So that's that. Next step on this, I think, once all that lot's done, is going to be dry sump tank and starting to go through removing unnecessary old brackets from in the engine bay, putting provision in for plumbing and that sort of thing. And that'll be the next step. Gaz is working on the Mustang. A lot more sanding. The main probably critical things he's been on with is we discovered that the rear valance panel left really an undesirable gap at the edge where it meets the quarter panel. So we lengthened that. He cut the ends off that, made longer ends to lengthen the whole rear valance panel to get the gaps acceptable on that. And then today he's just working on lead loading the rear deck panel, perhaps you'd call it, the rear scuttle, where it meets the boot, the front of the boot lid, to get that gap a bit more pleasing. We'd worked on that a bit before, but revisiting it after all the other gaps are so perfect, you kind of looked at it and thought that's just not quite right. So he's been working on that gap at the front of the boot lid. Last thing I'm going to say is Mark Steele from Newcastle. Your daughter Sophie wishes you a very happy birthday. You're 45 this week, so from everyone here at Retropower, happy birthday. And no doubt we'll see you next week. Bye.